Welcome to the Garden Podcast, sponsored by the Garden Worship Experience at San Diego United Methodist Church in Encinitas, California. My name is Mark Maddix, and I'm privileged to serve as the lead pastor here, and I welcome you to the Garden Podcast. The goal of the Garden Podcast is to help people of faith think critically, love authentically, and serve compassionately. And today we welcome to the Garden Podcast my friend Brian McLaren. Brian, as many of you know, is an internationally known author and speaker, activist. He's been a leading voice and continues to be a leading voice in Christianity. He serves as the Dean of the Faculty for Father Richard Rohr's Center for Action and Contemplation and hosts a regular podcast called Learning How to See. As I shared a little bit this morning in worship, he was with us, preaching for us. I had the privilege of connecting with Brian probably, 20, 25 years ago. As I get older, I forget the dates here. But his books and his work early on, especially Generous Orthodoxy, was really a significant part of my faith journey. It helped me to see that there wasn't this binary, but there was a third way. There was a different way to be a Christian in the world, especially as someone who grew up in an evangelical background. He began to help me think about the ways in which I could express my faith in new ways. So I'm deeply grateful for that, Brian. Thank you for your work and your ministry, your prophetic voice. I know it's not always easy going through that journey, but your voice has really helped people be faithful in their Christian life and walk, and deeply grateful for you and for your ministry. And so welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Great to be in
and look forward to this conversation. We enjoyed having you with us today. And we look forward to talking more about your new book. The book is called Life After Doom and Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And I would recommend, if you haven't had an opportunity to pick up this book, that you would do that. And our church, our congregation has been using it in small groups in several different settings. And I have to say, Brian, the book is a little gloomy. It certainly meets the expectation of the title, in the sense that we find ourselves in a period of doom. And as I read the book and thinking about the context by which we see ourselves right now, find ourselves, I thought it's a very timely book in many ways. And so maybe just begin by giving us a little bit of a introduction as to how the book came into being, why you wrote it, what is it you're trying to accomplish through the book.
Sure. Well, maybe I should start by saying, whenever you put doom in a title, it tends to suck all the air out of the room. Even though the title is Life After Doom, people hear the doom. But it might help for me to define what I mean by doom. Mm-hmm. People who study global issues, global crises, are describing the time that we're in right now as a polycrisis. And by polycrisis, they mean we have multiple crises, and each one makes the others harder to solve. Mm-hmm. You work on one, and then this one undoes your work. You work on this, and then this one undoes your work. And what that's doing to people, many people, especially people who are older, we've grown up in a world where we thought every problem was solvable. Mm-hmm. A little more technology, a few better government policies. For religious people, a little better preaching and spirituality. Yeah, all of our problems would be easy to solve. And when people reach a moment in their lives where they feel, I think our problems have grown bigger than our solutions can solve. When people feel that for the first time, it's kind of like a rush that goes through their nervous system. They feel disturbed by that. On a slightly deeper level, I think not just people my age and older, but really for the last several hundred years, we've lived by what a lot of people call the myth of progress.
Right.
The idea that things are almost inevitably going to get better, and there'll never be a downturn. And that kind of confidence that the future will always get better, when you start to think, actually, we've created some problems in our in our progress now that we've got to face. So that's the idea behind the book. Um, and this was of interest to me because back in 2006, 2007, I became interested in the subject of global crises. And I spent, I had been a pastor for 24 years. My first year after leaving the pastorate, I I got to just spend the year being a researcher, and I got to travel around the world, meet with amazing experts. And a book I wrote at that time was called Everything Must Change, and it
Yeah.
was about facing global crises. So in many ways, this has been a theme for me now for almost 20 years, and trying to come back and say, okay, what does it mean right now?
Yeah, it's good. I know in the book you talk about this sense of those of us who live here in the United States, we have this sense of over optimism that everything's, as you say,
Yeah,
kind of a Pollyanna world in some ways, that
yeah,
everything's great. And so it's hard for us right now to live in this reality
yeah,
of where things are.
yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting in the book, in the writing of the book, toward the end of the book, there's a chapter where I sort of indulge in this, but I had this realization. One of the main themes of the book is climate change. We discovered this bank account, like we discovered a bank account worth unimaginable wealth in fossil fuels. We didn't create them, we didn't make them. They are the result of dinosaur bodies and microscopic life from billions of years ago, and the organic compounds that made up their bodies have been changed. And we discovered, wow, this incredible fuel, coal, oil, gas, and so on. And that power that we unleashed is so incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It helps us do things. One guy sitting in a truck can do what 100 people working for a year or two would have been able to do with shovels on their own, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's just unbelievable power. So it's understandable that we thought any problem was solvable.
Yeah.
We had this bank account of energy that we could draw from to solve problems. What happens when the bank account becomes a problem?
Right.
This isn't a perfect analogy, but anyone who's ever had a problem with drug abuse, you take a pill, it makes you feel so good. You can conquer the world. You don't have to fall asleep. It solves all your problems until it starts creating problems.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And with that, you talk about in the book that, really you kind of paint a picture that maybe it's a little too late. Maybe the issue of climate change, we have been too silent. I know people that have been reading our book, reading your book here at our church, some of them have said, yeah, it really doesn't paint a very positive picture about the future. Maybe we're too far along the road here. Of course, at the end of the book, you've been to talk about, here's some very practical things you can do, but maybe talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, and you talk about the fact that so many Christians still deny the fact that climate change or global warming is actually a real thing, and they spiritualize it in some ways. That God's in control, so God's got a plan, and everything is going to work out. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what we do. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, when you take that power of fossil fuels and then you add a theological idea that God won't let us fail, we can do anything stupid we want, and God will give us a free pass, get out of jail free card. There's a deadly combination. So a lot of people don't know this, but with climate change, around the time of the Civil War, some very smart people in England, actually, and among the first was a woman who did research on her own. They understood that if you put a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, the carbon dioxide keeps the heat energy that comes from light under that blanket of carbon dioxide. So we have known about this for a long time. By the early 20th century, people made incredibly accurate predictions of what would happen if we kept burning. Back then, it was mostly coal, and then later it became oil and gas, and so on. But and really, people started sounding the alarm. Nobody would listen.
Right.
By the 1980s, most of for example, we know that many of the major oil companies, especially Exxon, they actually knew what their product was doing. And they made an intentional decision to hide that truth, to lie about it, but they knew.
Mm.
Um, and then when people started understanding it, they started saying, we've got to act before it's too late. We've got to act before it's too late. We kept not acting.
Yeah.
And at the last minute, in the early 20th century, we started building momentum. Um, and and then we've started making progress. Uh, but what we've now realized, it's not too late in the sense of our choices between bliss and total destruction.
Right.
But it's too late to keep the climate system that has nurtured humanity for uh, a million years. That climate system is now being nudged out of equilibrium. And so we're going to face, one way to say it is this: you can pretty much assume that last year was the coolest, driest year of the rest of your life. And this year will be the coolest, driest year of the rest of your life, because every year when the world heats up, it can hold more moisture in its atmosphere. That means stronger storms. It means more disrupted weather patterns, which for some places creates droughts and fires.
Fires, yeah, in California, yeah.
So all that's to say, now the issue is, how bad are we going to let things get? Because they're going to get worse.
Yeah.
It's just a question of how much worse we're going to let them get.
Yeah.
And that's going to mean we all have to make, we're all going to be forced to make adjustments. The future will not just be a better, easier continuation of the present.
Yeah. And that's going to be difficult for us because we're
Yeah.
used to living a certain kind of way of life.
Yeah.
I know our group today was talking about what are some practical things you can begin to do. And they may seem like really small given the big picture of
Yeah.
things, but what we do really matters. And so we have to start thinking at a local level, what are the things we can do, and to speak out when there's times in which we find that people are abusing that system. One of the things you spend a lot of time in the book, which I found really helpful, is maybe it's the influence of the contemplative life, but I noticed you spend a lot of time talking about how we care for ourselves
Yes.
through this process. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to lament. You have a chapter called Mind Your Mind,
Yeah.
And so maybe talk to us about why that's so significant. I mean, it's always been important, right? But
Yeah.
why is it even more important now, given what we're facing?
Well, maybe I can tell a story. I mentioned this in the book from history. In the early centuries after Christ, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, the Roman Empire was struggling. It was divided. It had a major problem of immigration. There were people coming from the north seeking refuge, and then that created new problems. It was the empire had expanded to be so large, they were sending soldiers to put out fires here, or actually fight wars here, and sending soldiers to fight wars here. They were running out of soldiers. For a long time in that period of the Roman Empire, it was the duty of each woman to produce at least 7 babies who would live, because several of them would be killed in war. And in order to just keep the population stable, they had to produce a lot of babies to make up for illness and war and so on. So it was a tough time. And finally, there was an invasion from the north, and Rome was sacked. It had been sacked before, but this time when it was sacked, the Senate fled.
Oh,
And some people think that sounds like a dream come true. But what that meant is literally the government fell apart. And it was a terrifying time. And there were 2 highly respected Christian leaders alive at the time. One was named Jerome, and the other was named Augustine. And Jerome, here's the way he described it: when Rome fell, it was as if the human race became decapitated. It was like, how can we imagine a future if the city of Rome and the empire centered there doesn't exist anymore? And so and this was, he was scared as a citizen. And as a Christian, it made no sense because the church had made a deal with the Roman Empire, and it felt like for Rome to be sacked meant that the marriage between Christianity and Rome didn't turn out so well for either party.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Augustine, who was quite a distance away, maybe it was a little easier for him to say this, but Augustine said, he said to his congregation and the people under his influence, he said, listen, don't worry. He said, empires rise, empires fall. You know, we have to trust in an identity that's bigger than the Roman Empire. And I think that's part of what we're going to have to do. Here's a way to say it. A lot of times people say humans don't have an ecological problem. The earth has a human problem.
Yeah.
Here's the way I'd say it. I don't think the earth has a human problem. I think the earth and humans have a civilizational problem. Our civilization is in a state, it operates by something called overshoot. And if you want to understand climate change, see it as a symptom of the deeper problem of overshoot. And overshoot's very simple. We're sucking out more resources than the earth can replenish. We're pumping out more wastes than the earth can detoxify. So when you put those two together, it means you and I inherited a planet that was slightly worse off than the planet that our parents inherited. And the planet they inherited was slightly poorer and worse off than, and what's happened since we were born is each generation has inherited an earth that's much, much poorer. It's richer in human wealth and buildings and infrastructure and culture and all kinds of things that we enjoy, but the planet itself is impoverished. And that's we're going to have a deep change in our relationship with humans. So our primary relationship isn't with a civilization, it's with the earth itself.
Yeah. And you talked about that in your sermon this morning, it's kind of the sense of the indigenous world that we're part of versus colonialism, and the fact of how power certainly impacts how we think about the earth and what it means to be good, not just stewards of that, but what it means to connect with that. And I think that's something we're going to have to think through. We have to find ways, again, to engage that in a very practical way. I mean, one of the quotes in your book, we talked a little bit about it, but you said that billions of Christians are both socially disengaged and anti-ecological. And I thought that was a powerful statement, and a sad statement in many ways. I've thought about that in the sense that the Christian community has been slow to get on board with the issue of climate change. And at least in our tradition, being a part of the Western tradition, we believe in prevenient grace that comes before, that God's Spirit's active everywhere in the world, and helping people know what's true and good and beautiful. And the fact is, people not of faith have been warning us about this, scientists and others, but Christians have denied this reality, have not advocated until more recently. And so in thinking about that, that's also connected with this narrative you talk about regarding capitalism and how they're all intertwined. Can you maybe speak to that a bit?
Well, first, let me say, as we're having this conversation, Pope Francis is in very, very critical health condition. Maybe he's going to bounce back, or he might be near the end. And when people are listening to this, of course, that situation we don't know what will happen. But Pope Francis represents a refreshing exception to the rule, because Pope Francis, getting close to 20 years ago, wrote an encyclical. That's a big deal if you're Catholic. And this was an encyclical, not to the church. Encyclical means kind of an official letter from the Pope. It was to all the people of the earth. And it was a letter that urged people to hear the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor. It's a powerful phrase. He actually took that phrase from a Catholic theologian in Latin America named Leonardo Boff, and hear the cries of the earth, the cries of the poor, because the way that we have made wealth especially in the last several hundred years, but this goes way back to the ancient
Yeah,
civilizations,
yeah.
is by exploiting the earth through overshoot, taking more than it can replenish, pumping out more waste than it can neutralize,
Mhm.
and exploiting the labor of the poor. Most obviously,
Mhm.
in the years of slavery, where people would treat their fellow human beings as if they were mules or oxen or whatever, they would
Yeah, yeah.
just beat them, and they had no rights and protection. So exploiting the earth, exploiting the poor,
Mhm.
and whatever the future holds, if we're going to get out of this mess, we're going to have to develop an economic system that, instead of exploiting the earth, cherishes, tends, cares for the earth. So interesting in the Bible.
Yeah,
Chapter 2 of Genesis tells us it's our job to tend and care for the earth. We're going to have to get back to that part very deeply. And it's the same attitude of exploiting the earth that makes us look at our fellow human beings and not see them as
Mhm.
precious people.
Yeah,
We're going through a lot
exactly,
of
yeah.
turmoil in our government right now, where we have certain people who are cutting people's jobs,
Mhm.
and they don't care. They make jokes about it, rev up
Yeah.
uh, chainsaws. They seem to have absolutely no
Mhm.
compassion
Yeah.
for their fellow human beings. Well, guess what, folks? That's been happening for a long time.
Mhm.
We have whole areas of our country in the US, we call it the Rust Belt,
Right.
where we use that diminutive, that kind of insulting term,
Yeah.
because we shipped a bunch of jobs that used to be done in American factories overseas, because rich guys could make more money getting the labor, cheap labor from overseas.
Mhm.
And when they move their factory, close down their factory, shift their industry, it wasn't their job to worry about the human beings who had worked for them
Mhm.
faithfully for 5, 10, 20, 30 years.
Right, that's
And
right.
so
Yeah.
this is the attitude that is, we're going to have to face this. And it's not just an individual problem. It's built into our whole system.
Mhm.
And that's what's going to things are going to have to get bad enough that those systems, we realize, yeah, those systems don't work anymore.
Right, that's right, yeah. And you talked about, Genesis, a lot of people, when they read that passage about that humanity was given dominion over,
Yes.
is often, misunderstood and misused to actually justify these kinds of actions and behaviors. What would you say to those that maybe think that, or would push back to you and say, hey, Brian, as you said, this has been going on for a long time. It's not that much different. It's not really that much worse. It's going to turn out okay.
Yeah.
And what would you say to them?
Well, I mean, honestly, if I were talking to them, the first question I'd say is, look, are you really open to rethinking things? Or are you so committed to the way you currently think things that all you want to do is argue with me because I'm challenging it? Because I don't want to waste my time if you're with a person who's not actually interested in
Yeah.
thinking. Um, First of all, people who want to quote the verse in Genesis chapter 1, where God says, give dominion, they better also pay attention to the verse in chapter 2 that says, God says to the people, till the earth and care for it.
Yeah.
Um, so, but then if we just want to talk about that verse in Genesis 1, I might say this. So the word that's used is, you may have dominion. Now, we shouldn't assume dominion means domination.
Right.
We
Right.
shouldn't mean dominion. We shouldn't think dominion means tyranny, unless we think God is a heartless, totalitarian, short-sighted, ignorant, greedy dictator. If that's what you think God is, well, then that God would tell people, exploit the earth. But if
Right.
you think God is wise and kind and good and generous and beautiful, and is actually the creator of this beautiful world, and cares about every sparrow that falls, and cares about the beauty of each flower in the field, and if that's the God you care about, and God is saying, I want you to live in my image, then we would expect human beings to exercise dominion as responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a way to think of it is, dominion means kingly rule. If you went to a kingdom and the rivers were all polluted and the fish were dying and the fields had been over treated with pesticides and fertilizers, and they couldn't produce good crops, and the people were hungry, and sickness was spreading everywhere. You'd think that is a really inferior, careless, reckless loser of a king.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
went to a place and the place was green and verdant and the people were happy and unpressured, and life was good, you'd think there's a good king there.
Mhm.
So I just think people have quoted that verse for centuries. And the other thing I'd say to people is, if you want to defend exploiting the earth, remember you're in the same club as those who use the Bible to defend exploiting people in the
Right.
era of slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes, even today, people still use passages to exploit the poor, the
Oh,
oppressed, LGBTQIA plus community,
oh my goodness.
groups of marginalized. It's easier when you have this sense of power and control to
Oh,
always to push aside those who are less fortunate, or those in need, or those who are marginalized by society.
can I just tell you a quick
Sure,
story
yeah,
about
yeah.
that? So when I have spoken and written about poverty and about stopping exploiting the poor, uh, I can't tell you, this has happened literally. It's happened in New Zealand, Australia, across Europe, and certainly across the United States. I've had so many people say this to me, but doesn't the Bible say, the poor you will have with you always?
Yes, yeah.
And as if to say, if we help the poor and eliminate poverty, we'll make God a liar, right? The irony is, what Jesus says, that he's quoting a verse in Deuteronomy. And if you read the chapter, here's how the chapter goes. There should be no poor among you, because the land is verdant. There's enough for everybody. In other words, if there are poor people around you, it's not because of a failure of the earth, it's because of a failure of how you distribute wealth. And how, so he says there should be no poor among you. But then it's as if God goes on to say, but because you're greedy and you're reckless and you're careless and you're heartless, then that's why there's going to be poor among you always.
Yeah.
So for people who've heard that verse selected to defend, it just makes you realize
Yeah.
you can use the Bible. Let me say it better. You can abuse the Bible.
There we go. Yeah.
To say
Yeah.
just about anything.
Yeah. And you missed the big story, right? The
Yeah.
big story of Scripture. Certainly, we know from the Old Testament the reason that the Israelites and the Judeans were placed into bondage. It was disobedience, but it was also primarily the oppression of the poor, the widow, the widower.
That's right.
Those in the community that were being neglected. And so it's a good reminder to us. I often say that certainly God favors the poor and the oppressed. God works on their behalf. And so a good test for us about our faith is how we treat those who are least among us.
Actually, that's another great example of just how inside out we get things. There's a group of theologians across Latin America where the gap between the rich and the poor was super, super extreme in so much of the 20th century. Of course, now the United States is getting that kind of a big gap. But the way they said it, these Catholic theologians in Latin America, is they said God has a preferential option for the poor. And what he means is God loves everybody. But if there's suffering among the poor, the message really of the story of the Exodus in the Bible is that God is willing to upset the pyramidal economies of the rich to help the people who are suffering at the bottom. And that's the very opposite of what's dominant in so many people's thinking today. They think, oh, help the rich, give them more money, and then it will trickle down to the rest of us. That idea has been proven false economically, but the rich keep promoting it because it keeps helping them. But it is absolutely antithetical to the scriptures.
Yeah. Well, and certainly we saw that in the recent election, right?
Yeah.
There's sense in which those who are more poor, those who don't have employment, economic issues, they place a hope in a leader that would somehow bring them out of that. And the reality is the current administration so far has done the opposite. It's actually done more to oppress and to hurt those who actually need our care and our help the most. And certainly as people of faith, we want to be able to come alongside, be in solidarity, to walk alongside and to empower, not to use our power in a way against them or to make us feel good, but to come alongside them, as you said earlier, to view them as, a part of God's creation. We're equal. We have a place to play in the church and the broader kingdom. One of the other things you say in the book is I think you always do a good job of breaking down binaries, right? And in the book, you talk a lot about engaging in critical thinking in a way that we move away from this binary language. And certainly right now, that's really, really hard, right?
It's really hard.
I mean, and I know in reading the book, certainly your passion comes out. You're very passionate about this issue because, as you said, you've been engaged in it for a couple of decades, and now as you see things moving the way they are, what are some things that we can do to help break that binary in a way that helps us to engage these issues more broadly?
There's an interesting feature in the Bible, especially in the Gospels is where it shows up the most, that helps me. And people might be surprised to hear me say this. But in the Gospels, you have all these stories of Jesus freeing people from demons. And look, I don't care if people believe in literal demons or not. I think, among other things, to talk about demons was a way that people would explain a systemic change in a human being where their personality changed. It was as if they had a personality transplant. Nowadays, we'd say might have been psychosis. It might have been, we would have diagnoses for, this is paranoia. This is suicidal ideations. This is, some sort of biochemical disorder in the body. They didn't have that kind of language. That just wasn't available to them. And so what they did is they would say, it's not your fault. Some evil spirit has taken over you.
Right.
There was a way to say, I don't hate you. I understand something has come over you. And what I want for you is not for you to be destroyed. What I want for you is for you to be freed of these bad influences that have gotten into you.
Yeah.
And what I think is compassionate about that view, obviously, I don't hold that same view today. If a person comes to me who's depressed, I want to help them get therapy and, if needed, medication and so on. I don't think anybody's going to pray away depression, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I think what this allows us to do is to say, you can be a really good person. And if your mom and dad and grandpa and grandma are racists, and all your life they tell you racist things that their parents taught them, and you grow up, I don't have to look at you and say you're a hopeless racist. I can look at you and say, you took in from people you trusted things that were harmful and untrue and distorted and grotesque. And I want you to be set free from those things. I don't want you to be, I don't want to hate you and punish you. I care about you. I want you to be set free.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I know in our group today after the service, it's called the forum, where we've been discussing your book, I gave them all 3x5 cards and said, here's an opportunity for you to ask Brian a question today in the podcast. And I went through those. And one of the overarching themes from those cards was this. What do we do right now when we feel in some ways like we feel like we don't have any power, any influence? We feel like this situation is overwhelming and we don't, we feel a bit frozen. Like what should we do? How should we act? How can we do something that makes a difference? And because certainly we can get fixated on the bigger problem and not do anything. And that often happens, right? I really appreciate in the beginning of your book, you said, for some people, this book might not be a book that you want to read if you're going through crisis or difficulty, because it's not easy to work through, right? Emotionally. And so what would you say to those who've been asking this question and struggling with, they see the issues around them, they recognize the problems, but they just feel like they don't have any power to make a difference? What's some things that they could begin to do and to think about to help them and to help others address these issues?
I want to give an analogy that I'm not saying this is a perfect analogy, but I think it will help me answer that question if we use our imagination. So slavery started in the United States roughly 400 years ago. And there were actually forms of slavery even earlier than that, but it really got going 400 years ago. And let's imagine you lived 390 years ago or 380 years ago. And you knew slavery was wrong. You had enough moral sense. People around you acted like it's no big deal. Preachers quoted the Bible, verses in the Bible, let's say misquoted verses in the Bible, but to say that slavery was just fine.
Yeah.
But you knew it was wrong. And you wanted to fix it. But if we could go back in a time machine to you and we'd say, listen, we need to let you know, keep speaking up against slavery. Do all you can against slavery. But you need to understand, it could go on through your lifetime and your grandchildren's lifetime. It could go on for a long time. And it might take a collapse of the Southern economy to bring the South to a place where slavery would end, right? Things could get a lot worse before they get better. So but we wouldn't say, so don't worry about it, just drop that, don't care about that issue. You'd become a horrible person if you knew it was wrong and you did nothing.
Yeah.
So then we'd say, well, what's realistic for you to do? And you would have done what a lot of people did. They formed abolitionist communities and they began dreaming of a better day. And they began spreading the idea that all humans are created equal. Even though that was in some of our important documents, we had a way of shrinking that from everybody. And we might say, maybe your congregation could become a place where you start living the way we hope everyone will live someday. And that might have meant, for example, I remember, you probably know this story so much better than me, but I remember a story about a Methodist congregation on the East Coast where they made the slaves sit on the balcony and all the white slave owners sat on the main level. And I can't remember who the preacher was who came in and said, this is wrong, And imagine if that congregation had said, it is wrong. And so in this congregation, we're going to sit together and we're going to get to know each other and we're going to treat each other the way people should be treated. And we're going to treat the earth the way it should be treated. And so in a way, it would be saying, even if everybody out there is going to do it wrong, can we create little alternative communities where we try to set an example of how things could be? And sometimes that's just a relationship. It's just a friendship. Quick story in this regard, where I live in Southwest Florida. And we have, crazy politics and a huge amount of hatred for immigrants. And the fact is, our agriculture industry is our second industry to tourism. And agriculture might be bigger some years than tourism. And our agricultural industry wouldn't run if it weren't for immigrants. Well, we have, my wife and I have a couple who are dear friends, and they're very wealthy. And they had a woman who they hired to clean their house. And they came to know her as a human being. And then the husband got sick. And that wife and her husband have taken care of our friends when the husband was very sick. And they love each other now like family. They have bonded to each other. This couple from Central America, they can't see their parents because their parents are far away. They've adopted this older couple, and the love between them is deep. And in that little home, there's a lot of racism around in our area. In that home, people are loving each other the way they should.
Yeah. So we can find those practical ways within our own communities, our neighborhoods, our churches, places of faith that we gather, friendships, places where we can begin. And we're starting to see that. It's one of the things I've heard from many people in a congregation here have said, we want to do something. We're not going to be silent anymore now. We're going to step up. We're going to address these things, and we're going to find a way to make a difference. And So one of the things I reminded some of the people that were reading your book that don't know you, I said, you're really providing a prophetic voice here. You're speaking out as others have spoken out for years about this issue.
Yeah.
And you're passionate about it, as you should be.
Mm.
And we need to recognize that part of the prophetic voice is kind of pushing us forward, moving us, helping us to lean into something that maybe we may find hard to lean into.
Yeah.
And so I certainly appreciate your work, your ministry, all the ways in which you're helping us to think through this. And the great thing I see is it's creating a conversation.
Yeah.
A conversation that we need to continue to be engaged in. And certainly we hope together as a community of faith, of all faiths, that we can bring about change and address these issues of doom and collapse and the issues that you've described in the book. So maybe the last question here would be, what would you want to say to those who maybe whether they've read your book or not, and say, given where we are, what does it mean to be people of faith and how we lean into this conversation?
One of the things when we look at the Bible in light of what is going on in our world today, one of the things we realize is the Bible is the story of what St. Augustine said, civilizations come and civilizations go. And the amazing thing about the Jewish people, of course, the Bible is their library, really,
Yeah.
Is that they endured through the rise and fall of many of these oppressive regimes, new economic systems, new regimes of power. And what we see is that they discover they can't make their ultimate confidence being in this or that regime. Their confidence is in something bigger than any human kingdom. And when Jesus comes along, of course, he makes this explicit. He says, in a sense, he says, stop trusting in the kingdoms of this world. Start believing in this higher kingdom, the kingdom of God, that you don't have to wait for. It's within reach. It's at hand now. You can start living that way now.
Right. Yeah.
And suddenly this stops being some mere matter of fire insurance for after you're dead. It starts being, which kingdom do you really want to have your allegiance to while you're alive? And that's a wonderfully liberating thing. It's good news.
Yeah, it is good news. It's what it means to live out the gospel in a way that's very tangible. Well, thank you, Brian, so much for joining the Garden Podcast today, which is sponsored by San United Methodist Church and our new contemporary service. We invite you to check out our podcast on the Garden webpage, and that is the Garden, gardenencinitas.org. And also, if you're in the Encinitas area, Southern California, we invite you to join us for worship. Our traditional worship is at 9:30, and our garden worship is at 11. Our 9:30 service is live stream, so you can certainly join us there. And we invite you to keep watching this. If you like what you've heard today, give us a thumbs up on Facebook and other social medias, and engage in conversation with us. So again, thank you, Brian, for taking time to be with us. We look forward to connecting with you again through the Garden Podcast.